Oh, hello. This is part 9 of my notice to the Universal Postal Union. And what I'm doing is invoking the authority of the Universal Postal Union in addressing and giving us remedy to the case that was brought to the Swiss court against the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, World Health Assembly, and some others, which wasn't able to be got from the court. And the next step is the UPU. So we the people would be grateful if you would publicise the progression that has led to criminal misconduct in public office being a matter that is not accountable in law. It may help to explain that originally privilege was a matter of status, and even then many argued that where no case was made out for exempting persons from the operations of the law, it is actually better to let the law apply. 70 years ago, governments were asked to change an already overstrained law of diplomatic privilege and exempt more and more people from the ordinary law of the countries. Governments entered into obligations of the United Nations Convention, as they have entered into the obligations of so many others without really seriously thinking of the consequences. And then the bill was presented and ministers were expected to honour it. Governments were asked to confer upon officials of the Universal Postal Union the full immunities which were given in the past by custom to protect the direct representative of a foreign power at His Majesty's court. Those in the past jealously guarded prerogatives have since been given, involving as they do not only complete inviolability of person and premises but also protection from income tax upon official emoluments. It was termed ludicrous back then in 1950 to suggest that it was necessary to create those kinds of ambassadors in order to see that the international postal services operate. People are naturally concerned with security considerations. Every additional step for conferring immunity from the ordinary law of the land upon persons, whether national subjects or foreign ones, should have been looked at from the security angle. Surely it would be right to look cautiously on the possibility of conferring protection from the ordinary law on persons who may be here apparently for one purpose, but who might be concerned to take actions hostile to the national interest while they are here. Think for a second of the World Health Assembly, who are made up of delegates with massive vested interest in pharmaceutical products, and how they were able to do business with impunity through the lockdowns and into the lobbying of their treaty agenda. Privileges were also extended to meat industry processors and transporters and 5G Wi-Fi installers during the lockdowns as essential services. Despite COVID clusters in their gruesome working conditions, and despite none of the population holding a 5G device to receive the frequencies, so clearly not for our benefit or use. When questioned, the government simply answered, "The meat barons are too big," for the World Health Organization says that 5G is safe. Fruit farmers were also granted the privilege of importing foreign workers by plane to harvest crops and not offer jobs locally, and the big ferries were sponsored by the government to continue each sailing without passengers, but to facilitate the pharmaceutical, PPE and live export. Accolades, though, to the Universal Postal Union's work. When the House of Commons considered the order of whether to grant the Universal Postal Union itself diplomatic immunity in 1950, the pros and cons were laid out. The UPU was said to have the most honourable record of service to international purposes and to mankind as a whole, irrespective of nationality of any organisation in existence. It was said that the fact that the Universal Postal Union has done such efficient service over all these years and secured the possibility of communication right around the planet is something about which we rejoice. They went on to say that many people who are doing work of the highest importance and whose integrity is beyond doubt are asked to do that work and to carry on their functions under the ordinary law of their countries. Their very integrity makes it all the easier for them to do so. I, Francis, am again grateful that the Universal Postal Union, which is the general international liaison body for national posts and which arranges the transit of letters and parcels and telegraphic communications, have mainly carried out these functions easily in the light of day and without any immunity from the law of the different countries with which they are concerned. There is a fundamental distinction, though, between a union and an ambassador or any other kind of envoy who is the projection into the country to which he is accredited of the sovereignty of the country which he represents. It is right that an ambassador should enjoy personal immunities and privileges and secret communications, maybe, with the country whose interests he is protecting. I really hope that the plenipotentiary ambassadors, with the extraordinary powers to make decisions for their countries outside of negotiation with their governments and with their heads of state, are still representing those countries and not just themselves. I also hope that every member of the Union has its plenipotentiary ambassadors in regular communication with you, as I understand that they do considerable work with the Universal Postal Union, so hopefully it goes for all members. Operating in two jurisdictions at the same time. The core issue is that bureaucrats cannot stand in two jurisdictions at the same time, diplomatic and corporate. Their competitive commercial activity, combined with an absence of liability, has alerted the people of the world to the irreconcilable conflicts of interest, which are attached here as an annex. For example, the man Jeremy from the Farah family, having patented a universal avian flu vaccine in 2008, is now in a position to declare a pandemic and mandate the worldwide purchase and administering of his product. We the people have simultaneously realised that we cannot stand in two jurisdictions at the same time either. In our true capacity as living men and women, we cannot contract with corporations. Could all those fraudulent contracts be publicly rebutted at a global level by you, the man Masahiko, and I, the woman Frances, so that all the good people who do not have access to the great service of registered post do not have to rebut every alleged claim against them? The mea culpa, which is this self-blame decree, which when leaders would say, we'll take responsibility for our part. Let me just not lose my place. The mea culpa would allow the UPU to admit that the granting of immunity has led to a misuse of powers. National governments did not merely grant these privileges and immunities to an extended number of people, but to an indefinite class of people, all officials of the International Bureau of the categories specified by the Director. So we conferred upon the Director of the Universal Postal Union, as in you, a delegated authority to confer a degree of diplomatic privilege upon his officials. I believe that you, Masahiko, and the man Majan from the Oswald family are the directors, and that you may now understand how an entirely new and damaging form of official privilege, endemic in public life today, was created and perpetuated by the UPU. It was assumed that everybody who has some connection with the United Nations, which constitutes an international officialdom, ought to enjoy this official status of privileged immunity, and it has led to a deadly international bureaucracy. As the UPU were delegated authority to grant diplomatic privilege on any specialised agency, I ask you now to withdraw those privileges. I believe you are in a position to do so. The granting of diplomatic privileges can lead to the most appalling injustice, and it already has. Pascal from the family Najadi, who filed charges against the Swiss president calling for the deportation of the agents of the United Nations, World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, World Intellectual Property Organization and other bodies so that they could be held accountable. You will have to use all the powers vested in you and the Universal Postal Union by treaty to re-establish the superior jurisdiction of life over money, men and women over corporations, land over sea. In commercial law, the ultra-wealthy, want-to-be world government, men and women, are conducting a criminal level of fraud, which should render all contracts void. In land law, the ultra-wealthy, want-to-be world government men and women are criminally fraudulent too, but also liable for prosecution and damages. We the people are grateful for the actions you take as a man and the actions you authorise the UPU to take in demolishing this mercenary war on humanity and its perpetrators. Will you make it clear in your public service announcements what exactly a special agency is, please, so that we do not make the same mistakes again and give an unfair advantage to a foreign jurisdiction again? In reference to the Charter of the United Nations, a special agency is an extremely vague thing. It is any agency established by intergovernmental agreement and having wide international responsibilities, which enters into an agreement with the United Nations and particularly with UNESCO. And we have learned that UNESCO has been embroiled with all sorts of curious organisations. In addition, the International Union for the Protection of Industrial Property and the International Copyright Union also have their offices in Bern, and maybe they have privileges too. We the people on the whole declare that privileges are wrong, especially for public servants hiding behind diplomatic immunity to avoid answering questions or being exposed and investigated for the harm they are doing. Our position is that people should be equal before the law. This is even though it will take some months before all sovereign nations have their general assemblies and courts in session. Apart from being bankrupt, incompetent and treasonous, governments must also be abolished as they have subjected people in their country to injury and the risk of injury without any legal remedy, and it was absolutely unnecessary to do so. It will be very cathartic to receive public service announcements from the UPU, reassuring people that all the claims, summons, convictions, credit ratings and criminal records against them were brought fraudulently and are subsequently written off, and we will receive compensation. Please explain that in practical terms the UPU are confiscating the assets and titles from the Bar Association, the banks, incorporated governments and land registry offices and returning them to the people. Thank you so much in advance. The problem with diplomatic immunity is that it allows an official to do or refuse to do anything he or she wants for their own advantage and leave whoever they were in contract with no remedy whatsoever. This is the situation that all United Nations member states found themselves in the last few years. We could perhaps offer principals and agents of the vast amorphous indemnified corporations an amnesty, where the heinous technologies and genetic modifications and fraudulent laws, taxes, patents, bribes and usury are admitted, and the fraud at last stopped and corrected. People from all nations will be satisfied to have their stolen assets returned. People will be relieved to hear that the directors of the international corporate institutions and their own military and governments are behind bars. Diplomatic privileges in the past may have only been used for the small courtesies of life. I'm sure it's very agreeable to pass through the customs without ever having to open a bag. It must be very agreeable to have use of a secret post and to be able to park one's car anywhere in the street. The stakes are much higher now that in the bag at customs a pharmaceutical agent may be carrying thousands of toxic mosquito eggs for undisclosed release, as happened in Indonesia, or a parcel labelled tetanus vaccines, where in fact the Bill Gates Foundation had swapped in engineered drugs to sterilise millions of women and girls, as recorded in the Diabolical Agenda in Africa. When corporations are acting and transacting without integrity, they endanger the whole balance of international relations in a way that men and women would never do. These are not diplomatic ambassadors conducting diplomatic relations. This is corruption and associated protection racket. In the case of diplomatic representatives, it would be embarrassing if they did not enjoy freedom, maybe from arrest, but how are the police to pick up those involved in this corporate coup and avoid future international incidents if search of their documents, luggage, and indeed commercial freight is prevented. In fact, the international organisations can sue any national subject now, but cannot be sued itself. It can commit any wrong and break any contract because it is not amenable to any judicial process, and there is no redress. This is how commercial law has gradually overridden laws of the land across the postal territory. Coming back to the restricted universal postal unions, it seems the UPU might have created ideal destinations for even higher levels of fraud. For example, there was pressure on nations to move their patent courts to Europe. In addition, people have been told with no consultation or consensus that national decisions on the admission of migrants will also be made in Europe. Will there be any liability for decisions made in post-Europe? We will discover, no doubt, that patent holders are protected, but there will be no liability for the harms done by the patented materials and no liability for the economic, social and housing crises and violence that is arising since the influx of undocumented men, women and children. I give the example of the allocation of fishing rights in Irish waters, following which Irish fishermen were forbidden to fish any further out than 1 mile from the shore and catch quotas of just 1 ton. Meanwhile, foreign super trawlers were allowed carte blanche to catch 15,000 tons of fish and throw the young catch back dead after sorting, creating dead zones. The Minister for Agriculture at the time announced when he returned from Europe that he had not even been allowed at the table. This means he was not invited into the room where the meeting took place, or involved in negotiations, or had any influence, let alone any power to secure an arrangement that benefited the Irish people or economy, or protected the marine life and environment. Because the premises of these organisations are inviolable and immune from search, as well as being abroad, any corporate institution can now hold a national man or woman under restraint without being liable to the process of habeas corpus. It could keep explosive on its premises, sell biotech without a licence, even run a gambling house, or run a whole corrupt government in most cases. They can refuse to pay rent and rates and not even ask to produce a tax return or account. A corporation's documents are inviolable and immune from seizure. I'll pause.